Indigenous Anti-Human Trafficking, narrated by Colin Graham. During this presentation, we'll be talking about colonialism and violence, the definition of human trafficking, the current situation, Ontario's strategy to end human trafficking, ONWA's approach to end human trafficking, safe spaces, and safety planning. The Indigenous Anti-Human Trafficking Liaison Program sought out the expertise of Mona Hardy. Mona Hardy is an Indigenous knowledge carrier, especially around the work of anti-human trafficking. And one of the comments or one of the quotes Mona had shared with us was the oldest living profession is motherhood. Why this was so profound was it helped direct all of the liaisons across Ontario to do this work in a nurturing and loving manner. We recognize that language can and has been weaponized, which is why it's really important for us to be very mindful as to the kinds of words that we use, especially engaging with people that may have experienced exploitation. The term victim and survivor are used throughout the entire presentation, as well as a lot of documents that you'll find throughout Ontario in regards to anti-human trafficking work. Here, it's really important that we um, meet people where they're at and let them identify who they are and tell us their story and explain to us who they are and where they're at. The reason why we use the term survivor more so than victim is because we come from this in a place, from a place of walking with people to guide them on their journey of healing. And when we recognize someone for their strengths, we recognize them for their experience, and most importantly, their expertise to being real leaders around community safety initiatives. Although human trafficking is an international issue, we need to be able to talk about what's happening here in Turtle Island, especially of that with Indigenous women. Now, Indigenous women have experienced and continue to experience colonialism and violence. Colonialism and violence has directly impacted Indigenous women's lives through the criminal justice system, as well as ongoing racism, poverty, substance abuse, isolation, and social exclusion. Some of the forms of violence that Indigenous women are confronted with, apart from human trafficking, would be things like domestic violence, physical, mental, and sexual abuse. There have been correlations for Indigenous women who have experienced exploitation and these forms of violence that connect them directly to the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls experience. All of colonial, all of colonialism and violence has directly influenced poverty, gender, race, and class. Contemporary sex trafficking presents in many different forms. We currently see about four main types, one of them which being the familial-based trafficking, which is often driven by poverty and is intergenerational. Familial-based trafficking may include the exchange of food, shelter, or money for sexual acts amongst family members. The second type is organized or gang-facilitated trafficking, which involves street-level sex work, underground brothels, escort services, as well as exotic dancing. Thirdly, we see substance dependency driven trafficking, which involves engaging in sex trade in order to maintain the chemical dependency with street involved drugs involving in human trafficking relationships. And fourth, what we see is the economically driven trafficking associated with sex work directed to serve oil and mining businesses, developments, or international events. For us in Ontario, what we're seeing, especially with economically driven sex trafficking, is that around man camps. So anywhere where there's resource extraction. So it's important for us to be able to engage with our young people about what exploitation is and what it looks like. The current situation in Ontario, Indigenous women, girls, and youth form a disproportionate number of those who are sexually exploited in Canada through human trafficking. Physical, emotional, psychological violence, and financial vulnerability create an environment of constant fear. I think it's really important to note here that human trafficking, it's this isn't a choice. This is often you're brought in layer by layer like an onion, and what happens is before you know it, you're completely entrenched. So it's not like you can just decide one day to come out of it. We have to be aware that trafficking in itself is its own culture. Thirdly, violence against Indigenous women and girls contributes to the normalization of violence and teaches women to accept this as a part of life, and this is evident through the violence, all forms of violence, like mentioned before, especially that of domestic violence, spiritual, mental, and emotional abuse. Exploitation is taking advantage of someone for one's own gain. It's really important to understand that exploitation, it's not about the sexual act, it's about power and control. It's about owning the ownership over somebody in with the sole purpose to make money off of them. So in order for there to be trafficking, trafficking has to consist of three main things, and that would be the act, the means, the purpose. In the act, we're talking about the recruitment, the transportation, the transfer, the harboring, and the receipt of a human being. Then you need to add in means, which is threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability, giving payment or benefits. And finally, when you add in purpose, which is the exploitation, including prostitution of others, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery into similar practices, removal of organs, or other types of exploitation, then you have human trafficking. It's also, I would like to note that there are no documented cases in Canada or Turtle Island of the removal of organs. That typically happens in developing countries. And when I'm talking about other types of exploitation, what we have seen, especially amongst Indigenous communities, are people being exploited and taken advantage of when it comes to, say, things like their artistic talents. So, we know from experience that some traffickers have taken artists, um, coerced them with alcohol or any sort of substance, or even shelter, even food, brought them back to an isolated area where they would then tend to get them substance dependent, and then they would get them to create their art, and then the traffickers or the exploiters would then sell that art, only giving the artist enough money for their next fix. When talking about human trafficking, there's usually a process or an evolution before someone can be exploited, and it's usually within four steps. It's really important to recognize that these four steps are not gradual, they're actually quite fast, and we will get into that in the next slide. As I mentioned before, there's a unique culture when it comes to human trafficking. It's more than it's on the street, it's called the game. And in the game, there's a lot of rules. It's its own culture. There's its own identity. There's a whole practice um, when it comes to the street life, especially that around human trafficking. So what tends to happen is in the step one, which would be, I guess, the initial meeting. That's where the luring takes place. And that looks like the recruitment process. It begins as, say, a friendship, or in some cases, uh, romancing the person. We call this Romeo pimping. This is when the recruiter or trafficker creates a sense of belonging and begins assessing that person's boundaries as well as accessing other types of information. Then it moves on into the grooming stage, which would also kind of be like the gifts with invisible strings. Grooming is also known as the honeymoon phase. This is when there is an abundance of gifts and a lot of attention is focused on that person. They really go to make sure that that person feels a lot of love and that they feel very special. After that stage, it moves on into coercion. This is where they tend to send a lot of mixed messages. A lot of gaslighting begins to happen, a lot of emotional highs, and a lot of emotional lows, like a roller coaster. There begins to become a sense of needing to get back in the good books of that person because they will do and say whatever they got to do to get back to feeling special like they did back in the honeymoon phase. Once the trafficker or the exploiter recognizes that that person is willing and ready to do anything to get back in their good books, this is where the exploitation takes place. This is when all boundaries have now broken down. There's now isolation from friends, family. There's a learned dependence and helplessness, as well as financial pressure, owing debts for gifts that were given in the grooming stage, uh, and as well as threats to safety, and not just threats to safety of the individual, but threats of safety involved with loved ones, friends, family members. And this is all layered, almost like its own hierarchy, and around the culture of human trafficking. Here at ONWA, Ontario Native Women's Association, we've developed a diagram depicting the life cycle of what human trafficking looks like. I think what it really comes down to is the conversation needs to be led with the systemic barriers that Indigenous women are faced with, such as racism, colonial violence, residential school survivors, as well as that of the 60s scoop, the devaluation of Indigenous women, and the normalization of sexual violence. All those bigger factors play into the normalization and the grooming of Indigenous women, and why it's easy for Indigenous women to be exploited or to be groomed and brought in and exploited at a much faster rate than the rest of mainstream Canadian women. Risk factors. It's really important to talk about how these risk factors only highlight some of the experiences in which Indigenous women have been faced with. One of the biggest ones is that of homelessness. Homelessness also includes couch surfing, staying within shelter systems. If you if the person has run away or continuously runs away, not only from home but also places like group homes, uh, someone's offered free food and clothing and shelter. Sometimes what happens is that there's something called Romeo pimping, and where the trafficker will disguise themselves to be someone's boyfriend, and in that there becomes a relationship where the the boyfriend or pimp uh, wants them to call them daddy or king. Another form is branding. We call it branding. It's where the trafficker would pay for or get them a tattoo. Again, in the changing world of trafficking, uh, where there used to be barcodes, dollar signs, or property of, we're now starting to see things like crowns or symbols that are directly affiliated with gang members or gangs, as well as individuals. And that's to signify ownership, that that person now belongs to their exploiter. Commonly, we see a lot of feelings of fear, depression, anxiety, helplessness. We also have recognized that some youth or women have joined knowingly or unknowingly joined gang members or gangs. It's quite common actually, especially with substance use or seeking substances. We know that another big risk factor is that if someone has been physically abused in their relationship, it also heightens the risk factor for someone to, for later down the road in the relationships with the normalization of violence, to be exploited. When another common thing is when your partner or your friend will say to you or the person that that something is owed back to them for providing them with clothes, food, shelter. Um, it's that's the process, we call it gifts with invisible strings. Ontario's strategy to end human trafficking. Ontario's strategy commits to a four-part action plan that includes a diverse range of perspectives from survivors, frontline community agencies, police, and public safety representatives, as well as Indigenous organizations. ONWA's approach. Here at Ontario Native Women's Association, we recognize that there is a need for transitional supports and housing for trafficking survivors to support our Indigenous community in their efforts to escape and begin their healing process. Indigenous women must be supported through holistic cultural grounding programming as well as services. It's extremely important that these services be delivered by Indigenous organizations with the input of Indigenous women with lived experiences. Again, it's really, I'd like to highlight that here at Ontario Native Women's Association, all the work that we have done thus far and where we're going has been guided by survivor input, uh, and that all our initiatives as well are survivor led. In continuing on with ONWA's liaison program, it's intended to support Indigenous communities in providing survivor focused and localized responses to human trafficking. The overall objectives of the initiative are building agency, community, and survivor capacity, to work with existing frontline services that address the complex needs of survivors, and finally, support Indigenous specific prevention and awareness. ONWA released Journey to Safe Spaces, an Indigenous anti-human trafficking engagement report between the years 2017 and 2018. The unique thing about Journey to Safe Spaces is that it was a foundational document that was survivor and community led. The interesting thing about Journey to Safe Spaces is that it was a pathway for new collaborative and integrated working relationships within Ontario, recognizing that the work to end human trafficking needed to be cross sectorial. Key accomplishments of the Indigenous Anti Human Trafficking Liaison Program were survivor engagements, survivor supports, community education and engagement, Indigenous women specific programming, interagency outreach and collaboration, as well as the Indigenous Anti Human Trafficking Liaison Interagency Table, the interagency strategies and action plans, and finally, training and education from local agencies, businesses, and to the public. With an investment into Indigenous anti human trafficking strategies, we are able to save lives. Apart from saving lives, we are also able to build a strong business case with showing a savings directly attributed to costs such as emergency room visits, ambulance nights at the hospital, long term medical care, and victim supports. ONWA in 2017-2018 had saved the Ontario government a total of $6,452,445 approximately just by exiting 11 women. In 2018-2019, ONWA successfully exited 29 women that were entrenched in human trafficking. This provided a total provincial savings of $17,011,255 approximately. One of the educational resources Alma created during the initiative was the Grandmother Earth Dress. There are 365 jingles sewn into the Grandmother Earth Dress that represent violence Indigenous women endure every day of the year. The Grandmother Earth Dress is a symbolic visual representation that brings awareness of the ongoing systemic and structural violence directed at Indigenous women. The idea was to create a red dress regalia in the form of a jingle dress, a sacred item of healing and honoring for families and communities to commemorate their loved ones. Families can visualize their loved ones in a beautiful traditional regalia. Normally, the color red is not a part of the journey ceremony. However, this specific dress was born out of vision and ceremony. Elders, healers, and knowledge keepers provided direction on how to feast and conduct ceremony. They also named the Grandmother Earth Dress, which came from the southern direction. The Grandmother Earth Dress honors mothers, daughters, aunts, sisters, grandmothers, nieces, and cousins in a good way. Alma believes in working through a trauma informed lens. One of the projects where we used trauma informed practices was the Mandela Rock Project. It was where we provided the opportunity for community members to paint rocks. After painting the rocks, the community members then strategically placed dots. While placing the dots, it was an opportunity for them to practice mindfulness, where they were able to think of good memories or in a good way of the loved one they were thinking of, as well as share stories about their loved one. Afterwards, the community members were encouraged to then place the rock that was somewhere sacred for them. So that way it was um, a way to honor, but also to help provide closure so that they could move on and begin their healing journey. While working with survivors, what we heard back was that community members needed safety. They identified that there were problems with existing services. They needed support services, access to culture, access to housing. They also identified that there were issues on reserves and a, a big conversation around prevention. While working with service providers identified that they recognized that there was a need for services for those that were exploited. They also recognized that there needed to be changes made in mainstream services, as well as looking at their program and system models. They identified that what was needed was learning, training, and knowledge sharing amongst frontline workers as well as people doing frontline work such as police officers, paramedics, first responders. It was also identified that there needed to be new language and conversation brought around legal and policy issues, as well as also identifying a need for prevention. After working with survivors then identified their own recommendations, and the recommendations they moved forward was a cultural and gender-based trauma-informed approach, prevention, survivor safety, supports for survivors, transition to a different life, agency and training and collaboration, policy, and system reform. After working with survivors, Journey to Safe Spaces was able then to use survivor stories to come up with a 6-point strategy. Safe Spaces. In Safe Spaces, it focuses on being survivor centered, prevention through education, access to safe and respectful spaces, core supports, evidence based, and streamlined supports. All of this is now being implemented throughout Ontario in creating safer spaces for women who have experienced not only violence but exploitation and human trafficking to come in and share their stories and access services. It was apparent right away in the engagements where we recognized the real leaders to ending human trafficking in our communities were the survivors. All of our initiatives here at Ontario Native Women's Association are survivor focused and, more importantly, survivor led. It's important to also remember that nobody owns story and that the story is actually the foundation as to starting all new prevention materials and workshops. When it comes to safety planning, it's really important to know that it's okay to trust your feeling. We all have a gut instinct, and it's important to remember that it's there for a reason. So trust your gut. Keep IDs such as your birth certificate, your driver's license, your social insurance number, passport with you at all times. Have a list of people that you trust with their phone numbers. Have your cell phone, bank card, any medication with you for at least up to a week. Call 911 if you're in danger. And keep an emergency kit with you or a person that you trust uh, with the above items mentioned. 1 week's worth include a change of clothes. We like to call them go bags. Safety planning for service providers. Always inform your colleagues where you're going when you're out in the community. Never forget, assessment, confidentiality, and documentation are key and vital. Know yourself. It's natural to have strong feelings and emotional charges, so self care is a must and it's a priority. Be aware of your contact information, such as your phone number, your online social media presence. Become familiar with services in the community, such as police, shelters, courts, hostels, emergency services, and so forth. Always debrief after a rough day in a safe and respectful way. And that concludes our presentations. Miigwech. Should you have any other further questions, please feel free to reach out and contact the Ontario Native Women's Association or go to onwa.ca.